In the early years of the Second World War, Italy fielded a tank that was meant to symbolise a new era of modernisation, the Amato M1340. To the Italian army, it represented a long-awaited step forward from the outdated and flawed M1139, adding its main armament to a revolving turret with more armour penetration capability and featured a modified superstructure from its predecessor. Yet, history has not been kind to the M1340. While it arrived as Italy's new medium tank, it quickly became a relic on the battlefield. Its bolted armour and modest 47mm gun, once considered adequate, soon proved insufficient against the faster or better protected tanks of its adversaries. Vehicles like Britain's Crusader, the Matilda II, and later M4 Shermans supplied through Lend-Lease. The M1340 has since earned a mixed reputation, respectable by some, poor by others. While the tank had notable successes, it was often let down by limited resources, poor radio communications, unreliable logistics, and a war that moved faster than Italy's industry could keep up. So, was the M1340 truly a failure of design, or simply a victim of circumstance? The roots of the M1340 trace back to Italy's experiences in the 1930s, particularly the Spanish Civil War. It was there that the shortcomings of Italy's early armoured forces became painfully clear. The small Veloci L3 series, often called tankettes, had been adequate for colonial policing, but proved hopelessly outmatched against even light Soviet-supplied tanks like the T-26. Their thin armour and machine gun-only armament offered little protection or threat, and they suffered heavy losses in Spain. The conflict exposed a truth that Italian military planners could no longer ignore. The era of the lightly armed, fast tankette was over. What Italy needed was a genuine medium tank, something capable of taking and returning fire on a modern battlefield. This realisation led to the development of the M1139, Italy's first attempt at such a design. Conceived as a transitional tank as the Royal Italian Army awaited for a better design, it mounted its 37mm main gun in the hull, operated by a limited field of fire, while a small machine gun turret provided only modest flexibility. Early testing and limited combat use revealed its flaws immediately: awkward crew layout, limited visibility, and ineffective main armament positioning. Acknowledging these issues, Italian engineers at Ansaldo and Fiat began work on a successor even before the M1139 entered service. In 1937, the M1340 project was launched with a clear goal: to correct the mistakes of its predecessor. It would feature a fully traversing turret with the main armament, a 47mm gun, improved armour protection, and a more balanced internal arrangement. On paper, it promised to bring Italy's armour into line with contemporary European standards, though, as later events would show, the world's tank designs were evolving faster than anyone in Rome could anticipate. While the M1340 project aimed to fix the flaws of the M1139, the realities of Italy's limited industrial base and strained resources heavily shaped its development. Ansaldo's engineers had ambitious intentions, but they were also under pressure from both the military and the government to keep production costs low and timelines short. As a result, the M1340 ended up as more of an evolution than a revolution. Much of the tank's mechanical foundation, including its suspension, gearbox and diesel engine, was carried over from the M1139 with only minor refinements. The new design featured a modified superstructure and the much-needed main armament in the rotating turret, but beneath these visible changes, the tank was still built around the same basic chassis and drivetrain. This approach did have advantages. It simplified production, reduced costs, and allowed factories already geared for the M1139 to transition smoothly into making the M1340. However, it also meant the tank inherited many of its predecessor's weaknesses: relatively thin armour plates connected by bolts and rivets, an engine that struggled under increased weight, and limited mechanical reliability when pushed in harsh conditions. In the end, what emerged was a compromise, a tank that looked new but was mechanically rooted in the past, a reflection of Italy's industrial constraints as much as its design philosophy. In October 1938, the Circolare Numero 3305 directive was released by the Regio Esercito, which laid down official requirements and standards of tanks. This included the new medium tank that would be named the Amato M1340. The circular defined the desired characteristics of Italy's next medium tank, specifying a top speed of about 30 to 35 km per hour, an endurance of roughly 12 hours, a 47mm main gun with a coaxial machine gun, 1 or 2 hull machine guns, and a crew of 3 or 4. In December 1938, an order for 100 of the M1139 tanks was made, but a further order of 400 tanks was placed for the future medium tank. By late 1939, the Reggio Esercito had received 96 of the M1139 tanks, but decided against further production. The Army required a better design and a better armament, as well as fitted radios, and it was agreed between military officials and Agostino Rocca, head of Ansaldo, that future medium tanks should be armed with at least a 47mm gun. The M1139's underperforming Vickers-Terney 37mm was not good enough. By mid-1938, a wooden mock-up of the medium tank was produced. Around a year later, production of the first prototype of the new tank was completed. Testing began at Ansaldo in October 1939, and after, the tank would be sent to Centro Studi della Motorizzazione in Rome. The tank was quickly approved, sharing many of the mechanical features of the M1139, but with a slightly wider chassis and modified superstructure. The main gun was switched from the hull to the main turret, and instead a small casemate added to the hull where twin machine guns were placed, with added internal space to the crew compartment. The new 47mm gun in the two-man turret would be the most powerful anti-tank gun equipped on a vehicle available to the Army at the time. The gun would be very capable and could fire both armour-piercing rounds to pierce enemy armour of most medium and light tanks of the time, and high explosive rounds for anti-infantry. It was more flexible than the Vickers-Terney 37mm on the M1139 that had poor armour penetration. The Reggio Esercito were convinced by the performance of the tank after testing, and around 400 tanks were ordered in November 1939. As production ended with the M1139, Italy's new medium tank would be designated Carro Armato M1340. There was a sense of urgency from military officials to get the new tanks in service, as Ansaldo engineers dithered and debated on design. General Mario Caracciolo, Chief Inspector of Technical Services, accepted the tank into service by January 1940 after the order had been placed. Had there been major problems with the development of the tank, then time and resources would have been wasted, and the Reggio Esercito would be in the dangerous position of too few tanks for the beginning of the war. Italy had stayed out of the war until June 1940, knowing that the armed forces were not fully prepared for a global conflict. The first production batches were completed in early 1940, with several changes including a new transmission cover, a hatch in the roof with 2 doors, a modified step to climb into the tank, different slots on the sides and rear of the superstructure, the removal of a slit in the turret's rear that featured on the prototype, and the casemate on the right for the machine guns became a single cast structure rather than bolted. There was an evolution of the M1340's design and specifications. Lessons were learnt from battlefield performance and reported problems. The M1340 went through a series of production models, Seria 1, Seria 2 and Seria 3. So there were differences, and adjustments in the tank design were made during its production history. The armour was supposedly designed to withstand up to 40mm rounds, but was brittle due to Italy's lack of quality steel. In reality, the British 2-pounder gun of 40mm could easily penetrate the armour of the M1340, and not much improvement on its predecessor, the M1139. The armour of the front transmission plate was 30mm thick, with the transmission cover and hatches at 25mm. The front plate of the superstructure was also 30mm thick. Sides of the hull and superstructure were 25mm thick. The rear of the hull and superstructure were also 25mm thick. Engine compartment to the rear had 25mm of armour at the sides. Engine compartment deck had 10mm with inspection door hatches at 9mm. The thickest of the tank's armour was the gun mantlet at the front of the turret at 42mm. Sides and back of the turret were at 25mm. Turret roof and hatch was at 14mm, and the whole floor had 15mm of armour. Most of the tank's armour plates were bolted to the internal framework, with some parts riveted, including the turret ring to the superstructure's roof. As mentioned earlier, the section for the hull machine guns was a single cast rather than bolted, but this too was of poor quality. The tank featured a 2-man seated turret, and the small, narrow mantlet was armed with a 47mm cannon and a coaxial machine gun to its left. The 2 seats were for the commander, who was also the gunner, and the loader. To the right of the gun was the San Giorgio optics, the gun sighting for the commander. The turret could be rotated either through power traverse or manual cranks. To operate the power traverse, the manual traverse crank had to be disengaged by pulling down a lever. The power traverse was hydraulic. To the left of the turret, between the machine gun and left turret wall, was the rack with ready-to-use magazines for the machine gun. The turret also featured hyperscopes for vision around the tank that poked out of the roof, either side of the roof's hatch. The turret also featured a mount for a Breda machine gun for anti-aircraft purpose, a late modification to the design requested by the Regio Esercito. A modification was made to the Serie 2 model with a bulge in the roof of the turret, allowing for more space and better gun depression. Maximum depression was increased from 12 degrees to 15 degrees. On the sides of the turrets were pistol ports for small arms self-defense. To the rear of the turret were the racks of ammunition for the 47mm. There were also storage boxes within the turret for spare optics and hyperscopes. The transmission featured 2 hatches above the brakes which could be opened to allow for the flow of air and cool the clutch. This was important in desert theatres after long travel. In combat, the hatches would be closed. The hatches could be opened from the inside while driving. To the right side of the hull was the support for the 2 machine guns. This was a spherical ball mount within the small casemate. You can see that this casemate is advanced further forward from the rest of the front hull. This allowed for more space and so that the machine gunner would not interfere with the turret's rotating internal framework and fighting compartment under the turret, known as the turret basket. To the left side of the front hull was the vision slot for the driver. The slot had a hyperscope placed above for indirect vision when the slot was closed, mainly during combat. The hyperscope had a 30-degree field of view. Headlights were placed on the sides of the superstructure for night driving. There was a large hatch placed on the left side for crew access. On the mudguards behind the superstructure were toolboxes on either side, and behind these were the mufflers. The engine deck had 2 inspection hatches. Behind the hatches were 2 horizontal radiator grills for cooling. In the centre was the fuel cap. Spare tools were also carried on the engine deck externally. Spare parts, including rubber wheels for the suspension, were carried on the rear. Machine gun tool sets for secondary gun maintenance was included inside the tank, behind and to the right of the machine gunner. The suspension was the semi-elliptical leaf spring system, already well documented on this channel. On each side the drive sprockets, 2 suspension arms with a pair of bogies, 2 road wheels on each bogie, so 8 road wheels on each side. To the rear was the idler wheel, and this had a track tension adjuster, and there were also 3 return rollers on each side too. The tank tracks were not very wide, which contributed to the tendency for the tank to get bogged down in various terrain such as mud, snow and sand. The M1340 featured the same V-shaped 8-cylinder liquid-cooled Fiat Spar 8T Modello 1940 diesel engine as used on the M1139, theoretically with 125 horsepower. The engine was mounted to the rear of the vehicle and connected to the transmission at the front of the crew compartment via the transmission shaft that went through the middle of the vehicle, with the driver and machine gunner seated on either side. Above the transmission shaft, in the middle of the compartment, was a circular floor for the 2 men in the turret to stand on. The frontal transmission connected to the front drive sprockets. The M1340 had a 5-speed gearbox, 4 forward gears and 1 reverse gear. The engine chosen for the vehicle was considered underpowered for the weight, and it proved to be unreliable in North Africa. The lack of sand filters in early Serie models was a big problem and will be rectified in the later Serie 3 model in production. The driver positioned on the front left had 2 tillers for steering and moving the tank, as well as a handbrake on the right and gear shift on the left. To the left was the dashboard, which was improved on the Serie 2 model to include temperature gauges and other switches, including battery isolating and heating plug switches. Both the commander in the turret and the driver had an identical telegraph system similar to a ship to communicate orders. The commander would select an order with a dial, and this would illuminate the driver's dial via an electric circuit connecting the 2 dial systems. This was for orders such as halt, about face, accelerate or slow down. I've also found out another communication device in the M1340, although it was not reliable, a direction indicator repeater. It again would send indications via a connected circuit from the commander to the driver for changes in direction and speed. Other than that, no intercom system, and so other forms of communication would have been shouting, hand signals, taps on the shoulder, or hitting or kicking the back of the driver to get his attention. The 24-volt electric system was produced by Manetti Marelli, powering the dashboard, front headlights, rear brake red light, 2 lights in the fighting compartment, and the electric starter. The fuel capacity was at 147 litres, with a reserve of 35 litres. Operational range was up to 210 kilometres on road. Jerry cans were carried with extra fuel to increase operational range. Maximum speed ranged from nearly 32 km per hour on road to around 15 km per hour off-road. The main armament in the turret would be the Canone de 4732 Modello 1935. The gun was originally designed by the Austrian Bühler company and would be used by several nations. This was originally a field cannon used for infantry support and could be used to penetrate enemy armour. It would be a reliable anti-tank gun during the mid to late 1930s. By 1940, its armour penetration ability was waning as more enemy tanks had thicker armour. The gun had a short recoil that would be ideal for the M1340's compact turret. The gun could be operated by a crank to the commander's left, connected to a worm and worm wheel. The gun sight was provided by San Giorgio, giving the commander a 1.25 magnification and 30-degree field of view. The gun featured an automatic breech, making loading quicker as it automatically ejected the spent case. Rate of fire was 6 to 10 rounds per minute. To fire the main cannon and the machine gun, the commander would operate foot pedals connected with wire cables to the weapons. The M1340 could carry up to 104 rounds for the 47mm. Ammunition stowage was reduced in the later Serie 2 and 3 models. In all of the Serie production models, the turret had a stowage of 34 rounds. Remaining ammunition was stored in the hull in a rack to the left side of the floor. The tank lacked heat ammunition for most of the North African campaign, but armour-piercing ballistic cap and high-explosive rounds were available. The Effetto Pronto shell was available by mid-1942, but only in limited quantities. There have been suggestions that the EP shell was ineffective for the M1340's 47mm gun. Theoretically, it was supposed to provide enough penetration for M4 Sherman tanks. The earlier APBC shell had around 35mm of armour penetration at 500 metres and 30mm at 1000 metres. Enough to take care of lightly armoured Allied cruiser tanks, but not enough for heavy infantry tanks like the Matilda II. The M1340's secondary armament was Italy's main tank machine gun, the Breda Modello 38, 2 fitted in the spherical support in the front hull, 1 coaxial alongside the main cannon. The machine guns fired 8mm cartridges and had reasonable accuracy. A 4th machine gun could be mounted on the support on the roof. This configuration boosted the tank's anti-infantry capability and an ideal infantry support tank with adequate anti-tank firepower with the 47mm that could also fire HE at fortifications. The Serie 1 model could carry around 3,048 rounds of 8mm rounds, but again this was reduced for Serie 2 and 3 models for unknown reasons. Only a few of the initial M1340s were provided with radios until 1941, when it became standard for tanks to be fitted with radios. The Regio Esercito chose Manetti Marelli as the supplier for the radio systems. The M1340 tanks were to be fitted with the RF-1CA radio. The tank would have a 1.8 metre long radio antenna fitted externally on the right side of the superstructure, which could be raised or lowered. Crew layout in the tank consisted of 4, the driver on the left of the hull, the machine gunner on the right, who would also be the radio operator, loader on the left in the turret, and commander gunner on the right in the turret. The commander did have too many duties, but 2-man turrets was common for tanks of other nations at the time. The production history of the M1340 was split into 3 Serie models. The Serie 1 model was produced from June to autumn 1940. It is recognisable by its 3-piece fenders covering the length of the tracks. The Serie 2 model had a short 1-piece fender covering the front section of the track. 200 of this model was built from autumn 1940 to spring 1941. This included modifications such as the new turret roof to improve space and gun depression, better dashboard and other minor changes. 410 Serie 3 models were produced from spring 1941 to autumn 1941. This model also had short fenders. Important changes were made to the air filters and engine cooling for better performance in the deserts of North Africa, as well as further minor modifications. There was also an important variant that entered production, although production was slow. The Kawamoto M1340 Centro radio was built, with around 10 delivered by the end of 1941. This was fitted with a more powerful radio, which facilitated better communications between tank commanders and divisional command headquarters. The vehicle features an extra antenna and less machine guns. This would be a noted improvement in communications and cohesion for Italian armoured units. Production of the tanks was jointly managed by Ansaldo and Fiat. Fiat's subsidiary Spar supplied the engines, Magneti Marelli for electrical components and radios, Pirelli for the rubber parts of the return rollers and suspension road wheels, San Giorgio for the optics, Calzoni Oleodynamica for the turret power traverse, and other smaller companies for parts such as air and oil filters, and the final assembly of the tank would be completed at Ansaldo's factory in Genoa. The tanks were being produced at the factory within Italy's industrial constraints, but another constraint would prove a problem: logistics. Italy did not have enough trailers to carry the weight of the M1340 or even the M1139. Light trailers used for the L3 tankettes were insufficient. In 1940, larger flatbed and two-axle trailers were in development. By December 1940, a trailer by Officini Viberti was adopted by the Regio Esercito, a 15-ton trailer specifically for the M1340 tank. Production started from early 1941. The lack of trailers meant that many tanks of the Regio Esercito were lost during the disastrous campaign to invade Egypt. Of the damaged or broken down tanks in North Africa, very few were recovered. The Kawamoto M1340 tanks were organised into M-tank battalions. Each battalion had 3 companies. 1 tank was provided for the battalion commander and 4 tanks for the command platoon. Each company had 16 tanks, 1 for the company commander, and 15 tanks assigned to 3 platoons. A total of 15 battalions of M1340 tanks were created and assigned to tank infantry regiments. The regiments would be assigned to armoured divisions. The M1340 formed the backbone of Italy's tank infantry regiments, particularly in the armoured divisions committed to North Africa, such as the 132nd Divisione Corazzata Arietta, and later the 133rd Littorio. These regiments were organised into battalions of medium tanks with companies equipped primarily with M1340s and later M1441s, assigned to armoured divisions and sometimes motorised divisions to give them a mobile striking force. In reality, chronic shortages meant that some battalions were under strength and formations were often improvised or rebuilt after losses, which hurt cohesion and training. The M1340 saw its first major desert employment in late 1940 to early 1941, during and after Operation Compass, when newly arrived units were thrown into battle with minimal training and often without radios. Despite a valiant effort to halt the British advance, M1340s under the leadership of Valentino Babini failed to stop the loss of the Italian 10th Army. The group of M1340s experienced struggles with cohesion due to poor communication, the lack of radios being a serious problem for the crews. There were around 40 captured M1340 tanks put into Australian service after the Battle of Bedford. Performance improved later in the campaign as all medium tanks were fitted with radios as standard. The 132nd Armoured Division Arietta's M1340s fought at Tobruk and scored some tactical successes at battles such as Bir el Gubi, .175 against the 2nd New Zealand Division, and .171 against the 3rd Indian Motor Brigade, where Italian armour could still fight British cruisers and light tanks effectively. These actions showed that, with good positioning and support, the tank could still be dangerous despite its limitations. Once the Afrika Korps arrived in 1941, Italian tank infantry regiments increasingly operated alongside German panzer regiments, providing numbers while German units contributed superior command systems, radios and anti-tank assets. Italian M1340s and later M1441s took part in combined Italian-German operations around Gazala and Tobruk, relying on German leadership, air support and anti-tank guns to compensate for their own shortcomings in armour, firepower and communications. In North Africa's heat and pervasive dust, the M1340's underpowered diesel engine and air filtration system suffered badly, leading to frequent breakdowns and heavy maintenance demands. The tank's increased weight over the M1139 further stressed the same basic power plant, and shortages of spare parts, recovery vehicles and trained mechanics meant many vehicles were abandoned after relatively minor mechanical failures. As a result, non-combat losses significantly eroded the strength of tank infantry regiments over time. Experience in the desert pushed Italian designers toward the M1441, which kept the same basic chassis but attempted to improve the engine, cooling and some reliability aspects. However, combat use showed that these were incremental fixes. The M1441 remained underpowered, thinly armoured and increasingly outclassed by newer British and American tanks, reinforcing the lesson that a far more radical redesign was needed than the evolutionary step from the M1340. By the end of 1942, it was likely most of the M1340 tanks were lost, leaving its successor, the M1441, to continue the North African campaign and defensive stands in Tunisia. Some M1340 tanks had remained in Italy and were used in the defence of Rome as the Germans launched Operation Axa to occupy northern Italy. Some were lost or abandoned. A few remaining M1340 tanks were used by the Germans in occupied Italy and Mussolini's puppet state, the RSI, following the 1943 armistice. They were also used in the Balkans for anti-partisan and security work. I asked the question earlier, was the M1340 a failure of design or of circumstance? The answer lies in modern perceptions of the tank. While some note that for an early World War II design, the tank was quite balanced and serviceable as an infantry support tank for the early years of the war, for others, who perhaps look at the tanks that the M1340 faced in the later years of Italy's campaign, it is viewed as a poor tank. The tank is not a failure of design but a victim of the rapid pace of tank technology during the war. The M1340 remained in frontline service for too long, while Italy's enemies were able to field new, improved tanks with more armour, better armaments and adequate speed. Considering the British Army had Crusaders, Churchills, Valentines, Shermans and Grants in its ranks by 1942, the M1340 would look like a poor tank. But it first went into service in 1940, at a time when the British had mostly early cruiser tanks, A9s, A10s and A13s. The M1340 was at least on par with all of them, and perhaps a more balanced tank than some early cruiser models. The only tank that would be extremely difficult to face would be the Matilda II, where the best outcome for the M1340 would be to disable the tracks and running gear of an advancing British infantry tank. Its reputation was not helped by the opinions of Allied commanders and British and Australian Army assessments. These assessments range from 1941 to 1943, including tests carried out on the vehicle. They are quick to point out the deficiencies of the tank, mainly cramped crew compartments, the two-man turret and the poor quality armour. But it is likely reports carried some bias and fails to acknowledge the weaknesses of early Allied tanks too. Reports that were released later in 1943 are at a time when the tank is obsolete anyway. But it certainly has contributed to the perception of the M1340 as a bad tank, an unfair appraisal for many who understand the challenges and limitations for Italy who couldn't keep pace with modern tank development at the time. The lack of radios in early M1340 tanks hampered its performance during the disastrous start of the North African campaign, another contributing factor to the tank's poor reputation amongst some. Many tanks were destroyed or abandoned amongst the chaos and lack of cohesion in armoured groups fighting the Allies. Many tanks were captured, and afterwards Allied crews complained about the tanks once in use. But later armoured and mechanised divisions such as the Arietta and Trieste put Italy on the road to redemption, and the M1340 did prove capable even as it was slipping into obsolescence. There is an argument that the M1340 was Italy's best of the Caro Medio tanks. It was the tank that was serviceable for the longest period, whereas the M1139 was not good enough from the start. The M1441 may have been serviceable for a very short period, and the M1542, even though technically better with an improved armament and speed, was also obsolete as soon as it left the factory of Ansaldo. The M1340 is also part of another important step in Italian armoured doctrine, the development of the Semoventi self-propelled gun. The Semoventi M40-7518, built on the M1340 chassis, became one of the most respected Italian armoured fighting vehicles of World War II. Inspired by the design of the Stug 3 German assault gun, the Semaventi provided the firepower Italy needed in the later years of the North African campaign. They often worked in coordination with M13 and M14 tanks in the Italian army, a cohesive fighting unit that could respond to armoured threats from M3 Grants and Crusaders. Another introduction was the Cado Amato Commando Semaventi M40. This was a command tank and did not feature a turret, becoming a casemate. It only featured Breda machine guns in the hull for self-defence. Production of this tank would start as the Semaventi M40 to 75-18s were being built. The vehicle was fitted with radio sets and specifically for the command of a Semaventi group. The M1340 embodied the Reggio Esercito's desire to field a modern, diesel-powered medium tank with a turret-mounted 47mm gun, but its development and performance were tightly constrained by Italy's limited money, industry and logistics. Those constraints shaped almost every design choice, turning what was meant to be a step toward modernisation into a revealing case study in how ambition collides with structural limits. The M1340 was conceived to replace the inadequate M1139 and give Italy a more efficient medium tank and better anti-armour capability. Requirements such as a 47mm main gun, a 4-man crew and higher speed and endurance reflected a desire to match contemporary foreign designs and fight more mobile combined arms warfare. Italy's industrial base could not fully support the level of modernisation envisioned, especially in high-quality armour plate and mass production techniques. The use of bolted armour, comparatively low-grade steel and small overstretched production plants all reflected a compromise between what engineers wanted and what factories and budgets could deliver. Chronic shortages of raw materials and capital meant that production was slow, numbers remained modest, and continuous improvement was difficult. As foreign tanks rapidly improved, the M1340's armour and armament, which were reasonable in 1940, were already slipping behind by 1941 to 1942. But Italy lacked the industrial margin to leap to an entirely new generation of vehicles. Even where the basic design had strengths, such as decent range from its diesel engine and acceptable manoeuvrability for its weight, maintenance and support systems lagged behind. The running gear required heavy maintenance, spare parts were scarce, and desert operating conditions exposed weaknesses in filters, power output, and reliability. Training and battlefield organisation amplified these material problems. Italian crews often received minimal training hours before combat. Many tanks lacked radios in early production, and leadership struggled to use armour in concentrated, well-supported formations at times. In practice, logistical fragility and human system shortcomings turned an adequate design on paper into an underperformer in the field. Tank design is inherently a balance among firepower, protection, mobility, and production feasibility, and the M1340 shows how constraints distort that balance. The decision to reuse the M1139's engine in a heavier hull, rely on riveted and bolted construction, and accept a 2-man turret were all attempts to contain cost and complexity, but they reduced combat efficiency and growth potential. As enemy tanks grew heavier and better armed, Italian designers faced a dilemma. Thickening armour or upgunning the tank would increase weight and strain an already underpowered engine, while a new power plant or radically revised hull would require industrial capabilities and funding Italy did not have. The result was incremental tweaks rather than a clean new design, leaving the M1340 caught between ambitious requirements and the structural limits of the economy and defence industry that produced it. There are 3 M1340 tanks that have survived and are preserved in museums to this day. One is in Egypt, the other 2 are in America. These are all lightly static vehicles and non-operational. I have seen an M1441 still in operation and running a few years ago. Despite the M1340's mixed reputation amongst tank experts and enthusiasts, it remains something of an iconic vehicle and instantly recognisable. The M1340 stands today as one of the most recognisable symbols of Italy's North African campaign during World War II. Though often outmatched by Allied armour, it represented the ambitions and limitations of Italy's wartime industry and strategy. Its presence across the desert battlefields from Cyrenaica to El Alamein linked it forever with the harsh conditions and tactical challenges of desert warfare. The M1340's image, coated in dust and heat, reflects both the resilience of its crews and the larger story of innovation, struggle and adaptation that defined Italy's role in North Africa.